There is a motorcycle whose frame was its fuel tank. Not a tank bolted onto the frame, but the frame itself. The gasoline and the oil rode inside the steel tubes of its skeleton, sealed in the very bones of the machine. It could do 60 miles an hour, and it did so in the year 1909, when most motorcycles were shaking, belt-driven bicycles with an engine strapped on. It was quiet, it was fast, and it was beautiful. It was not built in a back-alley workshop by a self-taught mechanic. It was built by a company famous for two things: gilded bird cages and some of the most expensive automobiles in America. And here is the part that turns a triumph into a tragedy. Every single one of these motorcycles was sold at a loss. It cost more to build than the company ever asked for it. This is the story of the first American four-cylinder motorcycle, a machine so advanced, so finely made, that it helped bankrupt the people who created it. Perfection, it turns out, can be a form of suicide. To understand how a birdcage maker ended up building the most sophisticated motorcycle in the country, you have to go to Buffalo, New York, and to a man named George N. Pierce. In the 1870s, Pierce took over a small firm that made household goods, iceboxes, and ornamental bird cages, the kind of gilded thing a wealthy Victorian home displayed in the parlor. It sounds humble, but look closer at what that work actually required. A fine bird cage is precision metalwork. Thin brass and steel, bent and joined and finished to a standard a rich customer would inspect up close. From the very beginning, this was a company that worked in metal to a high finish for people with money. That instinct toward precision and toward the top of the market never left it. By the middle of the 1890s, Pierce had moved into bicycles, riding the great cycling boom that was sweeping the country. Bicycles taught the firm about tubes and frames and lightness, and the tricky business of building something a human being trusts at speed. And then at the turn of the century, Pierce moved again, into automobiles. And this is where the name became legend. Those automobiles grew into the Pierce Arrow Motor Car Company, one of the three great names of American luxury, spoken in the same breath as Packard and Peerless. A Pierce Arrow was what a millionaire drove. It carried presidents and film stars. It wore as its signature headlamps molded right into the front fenders, a detail so distinctive it was almost a coat of arms. Each one was hand-built to a standard almost no rival could match, and priced accordingly. This is the crucial thing to understand about where the motorcycle came from. It did not come from thrift or from the working man's need to get to the factory. It came from the very top of the market, from a culture where the whole point was that cost was no object. Hold on to that idea, because it is the seed of everything that goes wrong later. The man who pushed the motorcycle into being was George's son, Percy Pierce. Percy was not merely an heir waiting for the business to fall into his lap. He was a racer. In 1905, he won the very first Glidden Tour, a brutal long-distance reliability run of more than 1,000 miles, at the wheel of a Pierce Great Arrow. That was not a Sunday drive. It was days of bad roads, breakdowns and mud, the hardest test of a machine and a driver that America could offer at the time, and Percy won it. He knew machines, he knew speed, and he knew in his hands what it took for a vehicle to survive real punishment. In 1908, following a habit of the trade, Percy travelled to Europe to study what the best builders were doing. He came home carrying an idea in the shape of a specific machine. He had bought a Belgian FN4. The FN, built by Fabrique Nationale, the Belgian arms and engineering giant in Liège, was the first series production four-cylinder motorcycle in the world. Its engine had been designed by a gifted engineer named Paul Kellecombe, and it did something almost nobody else was doing. Where nearly every other motorcycle of the day was one big thumping cylinder, the FN had four small cylinders in a row, and it drove the rear wheel through a shaft instead of a chain. It was smooth where others were violent, quiet where others were loud, refined where others were crude. Percy Pierce looked at it and did not just see a motorcycle. He saw a direction. America did not yet have a four-cylinder machine of its own. He decided to build one, and to build it better than the Belgians had. The result arrived in 1909, and it was called simply the Pierce 4. It was the first four-cylinder motorcycle made in the United States, and almost everything about it was a rebuke to the rough machines around it. Start with that engine. 4 cylinders in a line fire one after another in a smooth overlapping sequence, so the power arrives as a continuous stream rather than a series of hard, jolting kicks. That is what makes an inline 4 feel so different from a single. The company knew exactly how to sell it, and it chose one confident phrase: the vibrationless motorcycle. Think about what that word promised. In an age when riding meant being pounded by a single cylinder until your hands went numb and your teeth ached, the word vibrationless was an advertisement for a completely different experience of the road, closer to gliding than to fighting. It is worth pausing on how radical that choice was. The single-cylinder engine that powered almost every other motorcycle of the era was, by its nature, a machine of violence. One piston, slamming up and down, fired once every other revolution, and every one of those firings shook the whole motorcycle. Line up 4 smaller cylinders instead, and their motions begin to cancel each other out. As one piston rises, another falls. The firing pulses overlap and blur into a hum. That is why the great luxury engines of the age, in cars and in the rare 4-cylinder motorcycle, felt so uncanny to riders raised on a single. They seemed to run without shaking at all. Fabrique Nationale had gotten there first with Paul Kellecom's design and had grown its engine steadily larger year by year as the idea caught on. Pierce set out to bring that European smoothness to America and then to push past it. Because Pierce did not simply copy the Belgians, the FN used what was called an automatic intake valve, a valve with no mechanism of its own, sucked open by the engine's own breathing. Pierce used a more sophisticated design known as a T-head, in which both the intake and the exhaust valves were opened mechanically, driven by the engine, one on each side of the cylinder in a shape like the letter T. Mechanical valves meant better control of the engine's breathing at higher speeds, and the company presented it, fairly, as an improvement on the very machine that had inspired it. And rather than a chain, the Pierce drove its rear wheel through an enclosed shaft turning a set of bevel gears. No exposed chain flinging oil and grit across the rider's leg, no constant tightening and adjusting. It was the clean, closed, expensive way to move power to the wheel, the way a fine automobile did it. Then there is the frame, and this is the detail that makes the Pierce 4 unforgettable. Look at almost any motorcycle and you see the frame, and hanging inside it, a separate fuel tank. On the Pierce, there was no separate tank at all. The frame was built from steel tubing about 3.5 inches in diameter, unusually fat, and those hollow tubes were the tank. The upper tubes, lined with copper to resist the fuel, carried the gasoline. The lower tube carried the oil. Baffles inside kept the liquid from sloshing as the machine leaned and turned. The motorcycle's own skeleton was filled with everything it needed to run. It is one of the most elegant ideas in the entire history of the motorcycle, a true piece of design thinking, and it was there, fully formed, in 1909, on the first American 4. All of this added up to numbers that were genuinely remarkable for the time. The Pierce 4 weighed about 275 pounds. Its engine displaced around 43 cubic inches, close to 700 cubic centimeters, and produced in the neighborhood of 7 horsepower. 7 horsepower sounds like almost nothing today, but it was delivered with a smoothness and a flexibility that nothing else on 2 wheels could match. The auction house Bonhams, describing one of these machines a century later, noted that it would pull cleanly from 6 miles an hour all the way up to 60 in a single gear, with no shifting at all. 60 miles an hour in 1909 on a machine that could idle along like a sewing machine and then surge like a small locomotive. The following year, in 1910, the company refined the design further, adding a clutch and a 2-speed transmission so the rider no longer had to run alongside and jump aboard to start. That same year, Pierce also introduced a cheaper single-cylinder model, displacing about 592 cubic centimeters, meant to reach riders who could not stretch to the 4. On paper, the company was doing everything a company is supposed to do. It had the most advanced motorcycle in America, a broadening range from a single up to the flagship 4, and the enormous prestige of the Pierce Arrow name standing behind all of it. From the outside, in 1910, it looked like the opening act of an empire. It was in fact the beginning of the end, because underneath the engineering triumph sat a piece of arithmetic that no amount of brilliance could survive. The Pierce 4 was too good. Every one of those beautiful decisions, the shaft drive, the mechanically operated T-head engine, the copper-lined frame that doubled as a tank, cost real money to manufacture. And the company, unable to stop itself from reaching for the finest solution at every turn, spent more building each motorcycle than it charged the customer for it. At the start, the 4 sold for around $325, climbing over its life toward $400. That was not a trivial sum, and yet even at that price, the company was losing money on every machine that left the factory. To feel how strange that price really was, set it beside the most famous product in America at the time. In 1913, a Ford Model T, an entire automobile that could carry a family, cost about $525, and Ford's price kept falling every year as the assembly line grew. The Pierce motorcycle cost nearly 2/3 the price of a whole car, and it was moving in the opposite direction, staying expensive because it refused to be built any cheaper. On one side of the country, a company was learning to make transportation for the millions. In Buffalo, Pierce was making transportation for the few and losing money doing it. Then the ground shifted in another way. In 1910, near the height of the motorcycle project, George N. Pierce died. The founder, the steady hand, the name over the door was gone, and the company's leadership wavered at exactly the moment it most needed the nerve to make hard decisions. And the market itself was turning against everything Pierce stood for. The future of the American motorcycle was not the hand-built luxury machine for the wealthy enthusiast. It was the cheap, rugged, mass-produced machine that got an ordinary man to work and back. The real money, and there was a great deal of it, was going to be made selling simple, affordable motorcycles to the many. Pierce, a company grown from bird cages and limousines to serve people who never asked the price, did not know how to build down to a budget, and did not want to learn. So the most advanced motorcycle in America was quietly strangled by its own excellence. Production of the Pierce 4 wound down through 1913, and in 1914, the motorcycle company went bankrupt. In its entire run, fewer than 500 Pierce 4s were ever built. The parent car company, Pierce Arrow, cut the motorcycle loose and turned its full attention back to where the profit lived, on luxury automobiles. The machine that had been first was the first to die. And here the story bends into a hard irony. Pierce had been the pioneer, the first American to build a 4-cylinder motorcycle. But being first is not the same as winning. Just as Pierce was faltering, another American 4 appeared, the Henderson, which arrived in 1912. The Henderson was also long, smooth, luxurious and expensive, cut from much the same cloth as the Pierce. And yet the Henderson found its market. It found its riders, its police departments, its record-setting long-distance heroes, and its name became one of the most revered in American motorcycling. Henderson built a legend on the very idea that Pierce had carried across the Atlantic first and could not sell. Pierce opened the door. Someone else walked through it and took the room. The Pierce Arrow automobiles, for their part, lived on for another 24 years. They rolled out of Buffalo as symbols of American wealth through the 1920s, survived a merger with Studebaker, and then met the same wall that killed so many luxury makers, the Great Depression, when almost no one was buying hand-built cars anymore. Pierce Arrow built its last automobiles in the middle of the 1930s and closed for good in 1938. The motorcycle, the clever, beautiful, doomed motorcycle, had died a full generation earlier, in 1914, barely 5 years after it first amazed the world. There is a final turn, and it is the strangest of all. For decades after 1914, the Pierce 4 was mostly a footnote, a curiosity for a handful of historians who knew that America's first 4 had come from a birdcage maker in Buffalo. The machines themselves scattered, forgotten in barns and estates, worth almost nothing, and then slowly, as the antique motorcycle world grew serious and wealthy, collectors began to understand what these things actually were. The very first of their kind, made in tiny numbers by a company that no longer existed, and could never build another. Scarcity and history did together what the sales floor never could. The price began to climb, but the machine itself did not vanish. Today, of those fewer than 500 Pierce 4s ever built, only around 12 are known to survive. They are among the most coveted antique motorcycles on Earth. One of them crossed the block at Bonham's and sold for $161,000. Let that number settle for a moment. A motorcycle that lost money on every single sale when it was new, a machine that helped drag its own maker into bankruptcy, is now worth a small fortune. More than that struggling company could have dreamed of asking for an entire row of them. The market that would not pay enough to keep Pierce alive in 1914 now pays a king's ransom for one surviving example under a spotlight. That is the strange, quiet lesson of the Pierce 4. It was not killed by bad engineering. It was killed by good engineering, by a company that could not stop itself from building the finest thing it knew how to build, and could not bring itself to build anything less. It came from a world where cost was no object, and it discovered far too late that for a motorcycle sold to the public, cost was the only object that ever really mattered. A machine whose frame carried its own fuel, shaped by men who had learned their craft bending gilded bird cages, that ran smooth and silent and fast a full decade ahead of its time, and was buried in the end not by its failures but by its perfection. If you like the machines that lost, not because they were bad but because they were simply too good for the people who had to sell them, stay with this channel. Next time, another story of ambition that outran the money standing behind it. Consider subscribing and we will see you on the next one.